The Shmuz this evening is sponsored Le'iloi Nishmas Sheinanecha Bas Shalom. My wife's friend was once complaining about the chutzpah of the generation. She was talking to my wife, and she lives in Lakewood. Her husband learned in the kollel there for many years, and they were sort of talking about this issue, and my wife's friend gave her an example. She said, look, just the other night, my daughter was doing her homework, and she said, Mommy, I don't know how to do this. Could you come here and help me, please? And my wife's friend said, in my wildest dreams, I never, ever would have asked my mother to come here. I would have gone to my mother. I couldn't believe the chutzpah of my daughter. Now, Baruch Hashem, we have good kids, and I'm not complaining, but in my house, that doesn't quite rank as chutzpah, as in, Mommy, I'm stuck on a math problem. Could you please come here? But you quickly understand that there are different levels of what's considered chutzpah, different levels based on social expectations, on what's considered the norm in behavior. The reason why I say that was because in the very first parak of the Megillah, we're told the fact that Vashti Hamalka was killed. What was her egregious crime? What was her criminal activity? The king called and she didn't come. Now, for those of you who are new chassanim, do not try this at home. You know, if you call your kala to come and she doesn't, and you snap your fingers in anger, you're going to have a little bit of a problem. However, if you are the ruler of the most of the inhabited world, and you are a barbaric, murderous individual, then the expected behavior is such. And the expected behavior in Shushan was that the way Achashverosh snapped his fingers was exactly what determined how you behaved, how you acted. And when he called his wife and she didn't come, the conclusion was kill her. And the Medrash says it wasn't just kill her. She was born of Melucha. Vashti was the heir of the entire Bavel dynasty. And it wasn't just an issue of killing the queen. She was summarily beheaded. Her body was hung up to be food for the birds. She was executed in a very, very ignoble manner because she violated the king's will. Now, with that as an observation, let's very carefully read a pasuk in the Megillah that seems rather perplexing. Somewhere along the storyline, Achashverosh is convinced by Haman to kill out the Jews. The edict is sent out, and all the Jews in all of the 127 Medinas knew that it was over. Not only did they know it was over, Mordechai understood that it was nigzar, it was decreed min hashamayim. So he sends the following message to Esther. I want you to go into the king, and I want you to plead for our nation. I want you to beseech mercy. Esther sends back the message, okay, I agree. It's a good strategy. It's a good plan. However, I haven't been called for 30 days. It's been 30 days since the king has called me. I'm a little bit leery to go in on my own. Let me wait until he calls me. Why? Because everyone knows that Achaz Daso Lahamis, there's one edict in the kingdom. If you walk into the throne room of the king without being invited, you're slaughtered summarily on the spot, you're killed. Let me wait until he calls me. It'll be safer, it'll be a better idea. It's more likely I'll succeed, and then I'll go in. To which Mordechai answers back as follows. Vayagid Mordechai, and Mordechai sends back the message, Al tidami benafshech, don't imagine in your mind that you're going to be saved. Don't think that you're safe in the palace. Don't think that you're going to be saved. If you're silent, this time, salvation will come to the Jewish people from another source. And you and your father's house will be destroyed. Basically, Mordechai is calling her on the carpet. He's ranking her out. He's telling her, don't be a turncoat. Don't think that you're so safe because you're the queen. You'll be killed, will be saved. And basically, Mordechai is ranking her out. And the Yeshiva asks the question that it seems rather out of context. What Esther was saying to Mordechai was a very logical, intelligent proposition. I intend to go in. I will go in. However, strategically, it's unwise for me to go now because it's A, risky. I could be killed just by walking in. B, it's not as likely that he's going to be open to my visiting. Let me wait until he calls me. He hasn't called me already for 30 days. It's likely within a short time he's going to call me. Let me wait. He'll call me and it'll be more likely that I'll succeed. Not only doesn't Mordechai address what she says, he ranks around and calls her, almost calls her name, saying she's trying to save herself, she's trying to pretend she's a shiksa hiding in the palace. Don't think you're going to get away with it. You and your entire family is going to die out, and the Jewish people will be saved. The Yeshiva's question was that it seems rather unusual that A, Mordechai did not address the point that she made. B, why is he calling her to task when what she's saying seems rather logical? And to fully put this into perspective, I want to share with you two things. Number one, the FaceTime of Achashverosh was controlled by one individual. You see, that edict, that if you walk into the throne room, you are killed unless the king puts down his scepter, was enacted because of Haman's advice. The Targum Yonasan tells us that Haman was the controlling force. Haman was the one who approved the list of visitors, and FaceTime with Achashverosh was controlled by Haman. Needless to say, if Esther were to walk in and Haman were to get wind of what she was attempting to do, it would end very, very badly. But to appreciate the gravity of the situation, the Medrash tells us what in fact happened. When Esther walked in, she wore malchus, she wore the lavush, she wore the royal crown, she wore the royal robe. She walked in looking like the queen. She walks into the royal throne room, and as she enters, the two guardsmen who were right by Achashverosh's throne march forward to murder her. And they were just about to slaughter the queen on the throne room floor when the Malach comes, takes the scepter of Achashverosh, points it down, at which point the two guards saw that, they stepped back. Had that Malach not been there, she would have been killed. Meaning the standard approach was, if you walk into the throne room without being invited, you're killed. It doesn't matter if you're important, it doesn't matter if you're wealthy, it doesn't matter if you're the queen. That is achas dasu lahamis, that is the honor, that is the throne room rule, and that is Achashverosh's way of acting. And with that as a focal point, I think the question becomes a bit more perplexing, because what Esther was saying was quite logical. It is foolhardy for me to walk in now. Let me wait. Let's use our heads. And not only doesn't Mordechai agree, he doesn't even address the point. He just summarily ranks her out and calls her almost all kinds of names. And the Yeshiva's question is that doesn't seem to make much sense. So I'd like to see this evening if we could deal with this question and get a better understanding of why it is that Mordechai addressed Esther in that particular way. And to do this, I'd like to share with you an interesting observation. Sally Boyson, who is a professor and she's the director of Comparative Cognition Project at Ohio State University. What is comparative cognition? They compare the intelligent levels of different primates. She spent 30 years studying the intelligent level of chimpanzees. And she's done various experiments, many of which are fascinating, and one I find very, very telling. She took the following as an example. She would take a number of chimps, and she would hold out two trays. On one tray were tokens. There were a large amount of tokens. On the other tray were less tokens. The chimps who chose the tray with more tokens would then get a smaller amount of M&Ms. When the chimps chose the tray with the less tokens, they got more. Reverse intuition. Very quickly, the chimps learned that more equals less, and within a few trials, every time thereafter, the chimps would invariably take the tray with less of the tokens, because they knew it meant more M&Ms. The chimps liked M&Ms. More equals less. They got it in no time. Time after time after time, they were perfect at it. One minor change in the experiment, and things changed radically. Same two trays, one with more, one with less, but this time not with tokens, but with real M&Ms. The tray had more, the tray had less. Invariably, time after time, the chimp would reach out for the tray with more M&Ms. It would get rewarded with the less M&Ms, and invariably, time after time, it could not overcome that obstacle. It invariably would reach for the tray with the more M&Ms, and each and every time, it would get the less M&Ms, time after time after time. And the reason isn't that the chimp was not smart enough to do the math, more equals less, less equals more. It clearly had that intellect, because with the tokens, it did it every time. The change here was that it was no longer tokens, it was now the real stuff, it was M&Ms. And now there was a challenge, because intellectually, intelligently, the chimp understood that if I reach for the tray that has more, I'm going to get less. But the tray that had more was too appealing. The animal instinct was so powerful that the tray with more was right there. The intellect was overridden by the appetite. The seichel of the chimp, which was quite weak, was overridden by its taiva, and time after time it reached for the tray with the more M&Ms and got the less. Now, the key distinction in this exhibit between a chimp and a man is the fact that the man has a piece to him that is not in the chimp, and that is the anochi, the I. The master of my ship is the I who rides between the seichel, the intellect, and the appetite. I am not intelligence, nor am I the appetites. I, whom speaking to, am the one who decides on whether I should listen to the desire, whether I should listen to the intellect. I'm the one who sits in between. Because of that, I can choose whether to listen to the desire, to ignore the desire. I can listen to my seichel, to my intellect. I can give in to the appetite. But at the end of the day, I choose. And that is the definition of any nisayon, any test that we face. Desire versus intellect. I'm in the middle. Which do I choose? I make my choice. However, you should know that the vast, vast majority of fights that we fight, moral issues, ethical issues, have nothing to do with this scenario. It's very, very rare that the division is so clear. I know it's wrong, but I want it. It very, very rarely comes about in our life that I clearly understand this activity is wrong, but I want to do it. And really, that is not the bulk of our issues. If you want to know where the bulk of our fights are at, the bulk of our growth, the bulk of our nisyonos are in a very different way. And that's something that the Mesil Shem explains to us. He says that when Hashem created this world, Hashem put us in what's known as choshech, the darkness of physicality. In fact, he quotes a pasuk, Tash choshech v'hi laila, darkness settles and it's night. Zeh olam hazeh shedom lalayla. This world that we live in, the world of physicality, the world of materialism, is the darkness of night to the seichel. You see, it's not animal desire versus intellect. It's that my intelligence becomes blinded. The physicality, the desires, the drives, the passions blind my mind's eye till I no longer see what's right and what's wrong. I no longer clearly see the more versus the less. And because I'm drawn into this darkness, that's why we face so many nisyonos. And the Mesil Shem explains to us that the darkness of night that the world of physicality brings to the seichel really causes two types of mistakes. He says if you're in the dark, there are two very distinct types of errors you could make. If you walk into a dark room, you could be walking in that room and not even see the obstacle. You could not even see the pothole. You could walk into the pothole, trip, fall into it, and not even be aware of it. That's the first type of mistake that darkness will cause a person to make. However, he says there's a second, more insidious, more dangerous type of mistake that darkness will cause a man to make. And that is as follows. He says, it will cause a man to see an amud ki'ilu adam. A man will see something in the dark, and he'll say, oh, look at that, it's a pillar. He won't realize that it's a man, Or he might look at something and say, oh my goodness, that's a man. And in reality, it's a pillar. Meaning the darkness will cause your sight to be incorrect. It'll cause you to make an error. You'll see one thing and you won't see it clearly. You'll think it's one thing and really it's something else. And the darkness of physicality obscures your vision and you don't see things properly. This, my friends, is the most common of our battles. This is really, really where the action's at. Any time that I'm involved in a test, in an assignment, it's because the darkness of physicality draws a very, very clear covering over my eyes, and no longer can I see things, no longer can I perceive them. Things get very dark. Now, if you're not quite sure what I'm referring to, let me mention something that was discussed in a previous Shmuz. In Shmuz on marriage, we discussed the following interesting observation. Many people, if not most, some point after they get married, whether it be 2 weeks after they're married, 2 months after they're married, wake up and say to themselves, I made the biggest mistake in my life. How did I do it? What was wrong with me? And depending on how serious you feel that error is, will determine how big you think you made your mistake. And in that Shmuz, we discussed the fact that most of the time, it's not that you made a mistake. Most of the time, it's because the obligation upon you is to grow, to change, to learn to live with another person, and that's difficult. However, here's a very, very important point. You're an intelligent person. You're a thinking person. How did you make such a dumb error? Whatever your beef is, whatever your issue is, you feel now in your mind's eye, you're very certain that your wife is lazy, critical, tough, she cries too much. Whatever your issue is, you now know that you made the biggest mistake in your life and you married the wrong person. Sir, I have a very significant question to ask you. You're a smart person. You're intelligent. You're very insightful. How could you have been so dumb? Meaning, didn't you realize that she was harsh? Didn't you see that she was tough? Didn't you realize that that was her nature? And if you push the buttons and you really ask the person to be critically honest, they'll say, well, I did see some signs of that, but, yeah, I thought I could live with it. I thought it was cute. I found it engaging and entertaining. I don't find it that way any longer. And the key distinction is, as we discussed in that Shmuz, that there is something called infatuation. Infatuation is a power that Hashem put in the world to allow couples to get married. You see, two people come from very different worlds, very different natures. To allow them to blend, to allow them to come together, Hashem put this sense of infatuation, the sense of the beginning stages of love in the heart of the human, so that there's a sense of euphoria, this and everything is grand and everything is glorious. Her mistakes aren't mistakes, her problems aren't problems. I could live with her forever, everything's going to be beautiful. And then the drug wears off and, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into? But you see, my friends, here's the point. You may be brilliant. You could be extraordinarily insightful, but you were dumb as sin. Why? Because there was a mood that came over you, a sense of euphoria, whatever you may call it, that blinded you to the extent that you made what you now perceive as the most egregious mistake in your life. Now again, most of the time, the vast majority of times, it was not a mistake, but rather this is the growth stages and maybe the pain of growth that you have to go through. But the reality is, in your mind's eye now, you've just proven this yesod very clearly, that you could be intelligent, you could be smart, but when it comes to your own life, I guarantee you're going to be dumb. And the Mesilas Yesharim says this very clearly. He says, you ever notice that if you'll come to me for advice, I could sit back with my sage wisdom, assess the situation, cool and calculated, and offer you very, very good advice. Yet when it comes to my life, I'm a dummy. What happened? The answer is really quite simple. Every one of us have biases, prejudices, self-interest that blind us. And I can be very insightful, very wise when it comes to analyzing your life, when it comes to analyzing the situations that you go through, because I sit back from a dispassionate standpoint, and I can assess it and advise you what to do. But the minute it's me in the center of that question, I become no geya b'davar, I become biased, I become prejudiced. My cool, calculated sense of intelligence is gone, and I act like a fool. My mind is blinded, the darkness of physicality overcomes me, and I act in a very, very foolish way. I believe the answer to the question about Mordechai, the Yeshiva explained quite simply. And that is that Mordechai understood what was happening to Esther. He read into her in a very, very insightful manner. He recognized that at the core of what was motivating her was a self-interest, a bias, a negia. She felt on some level secure and safe in the palace. Granted, she knew she was Jewish. Granted, she was dedicated to her people. Granted, she would have given up her life for her people. But on some level, there was a sense of security. I'm not in danger because I'm the queen. And Mordechai detected that. And Mordechai also understood that that was really the driving force in the very careful weighing out whether she should go in immediately or delay. What was really the pivotal point was that bias, that prejudice, that negia, that I'm safe, I'm not in danger. Had she known fully that she's in the same exact boat as every other Jew, she wouldn't have reacted that way. And what Mordechai did was he cut to the chase. He spoke right to the bias, right to the prejudice, and he said to her, do not think that you're safe. Don't think that you're a queen and you'll escape. You and your father's house will be destroyed. He spoke to the prejudice, he spoke to the negia, he cut away the bias. And this concept, Yeshiva explained to us, is very, very key for understanding how to deal with many, many situations in life. Because invariably, when I am at the center of the question, I am biased, I am prejudiced, and gone is the sense of cool, dispassionate intellect, and therefore my own judgment is greatly to be questioned. And I think there's an interesting application of this concept in a very similar mode that Rav Dessler explains to us in the Michtav Me'Eliyahu. He says that people often take the attitude that the previous generations were sort of primitive, very simple. For instance, let's take a look. When Avram decides to marry off his son, what does he do? He sends Eliezer. Eliezer goes out, picks a wife, and Yitzhak, the primitive, simplistic person, just accepts her. Whatever the servant of my father says will be good enough, and he accepts her, fine and dandy, everything's good. Says Rav Dessler, we today are far more sophisticated. We feel we're far more intelligent. We're far more inquisitive. We couldn't just rely on that simplistic sort of system, trusting somebody else. We're much more demanding, much more intellectually fulfilling. We couldn't possibly settle for that. Says Rav Dessler, a very simple observation. That same person who thinks that he's so intelligent, that same person who thinks that he's so scrutinizing, is exactly the guy who wakes up and says, I made the most serious mistake in my life. Meaning, that's the guy who wakes up and says, I blew it. The guy who thinks he's so cold and calculated, who can't rely on someone else's judgment because it's too risky, relies on his own judgment, and only later realizes how foolish he is, and even when he makes the mistake, and by the way, even if he really made a mistake and really divorces his wife, never recognizes that the process that he went through was foolish. You see, what the Avos did was recognize human frailty. Yitzhak understood that if he were to go out and pick a wife, he would be nogea b'davar, he'd be prejudiced, he'd be biased, he would not have the dispassionate logic, that perspective of weighing that Eliezer did. The reality is that what Yitzhak did was a much more intelligent way of doing things. We don't do that in our world. That's not the way we're knowing, that's not the way we act. But if you want to be really objective about it, that is a far more intelligent manner to go about things, to trust someone else's judgment, because any time that you're involved in a decision, you're biased, you're prejudiced, and you're going to make mistakes. And as a matter of fact, the Mesilas Yesharim gives us a mashal that I find very, very telling. I once mentioned this before. But many years ago, I was in Rochester and I took my kids to what was known as a corn maze. The amazing maze, M-A-I-Z-E. And basically this maze is a corn maze cut out of, again, corn grows 6 to 8 feet tall. And what they would do is they would cut out of this cornfield a maze. Much like you see in the newspaper, a little maze that you go back and forth. So they cut out of a huge cornfield a maze, and you'd go to a dead end, and you turn back, and there was left turn, right turn. So I took my kids, and we all went to the maze, and they even had maps and hints and whatever. And I told my kids, don't worry, come on, let's have a good time. I took one kid who was in a stroller, another couple of little guys were walking, and we're going through the maze. We make a left, we make a right, we get to a dead end, we come back. One kid's getting a little kvetchy, one kid's getting a little tired. I said, don't worry guys, we'll get out of here in a few minutes, we'll be fine. About a half hour into this little routine, one of the kids says, Abba, didn't we see this before? Oh, yeah, we did. Don't worry guys, another left turn, right turn, we'll be fine. Left turn, right turn, left turn, right turn, left turn, right turn. Abba, we were here before, weren't we? Oh. And it's getting hot, and the kids are getting fetchy, and I'm in big trouble. They have these little pipes that you speak into. The pipe it's a acoustically sound pipe, and basically the sound goes to someone who's sitting in what looks like a beach chair, looking down on the maze, and I call out the very, very judicious words of a father, help! My kids are getting crazy. At which point the fellow in the beach chair looks down and says the words, keep your left hand on the corn. Should kind of keep my left hand on the corn. I'm in trouble. My kids are fetching. I'm in here. It's hot. I got to get out. Keep your left hand on the corn. Fine. I keep my left hand on the corn, and I walk out, and I walk out, and I walk out. And what he was saying was, just keep making lefts. See, if you keep your left hand on the corn, all you're going to do is make every left turn, turn. Within about 10 minutes, we're outside of the maze. Now, the reason why I share that with you is because the Mesilas Yesharim says that is life. You see, when you're in the maze, you get to the wall, you look left, you look right, and you can't tell the difference between which path you're going on. And you decide, based on my wisdom, based on my understanding, I'm going to make a left because it makes sense to me. But the reality is you don't know. You've never been here before, you've never gone down this path, and you don't have a method via which to judge whether you're making an intelligent decision or a foolish decision. So you make the left, and you turn, that turns out to be a dead end. So you turn back, and this time you make a right, and you make a wrong turn and a right turn, a wrong turn and a right, and at the end of the day, you don't have a clue to where you are. However, Mesilas Yesharim says, if you have a different vantage point, if you're the man who's up in the beach chair looking down, you can advise others and say, keep your left hand on the corn, meaning all you got to do is go this way, and this way, because his perspective is above looking down. Says Mesilas Yesharim, that is the reason we ask wise men for advice, because they've been down this path already, they've been through life, they have more life experience, more wisdom, they've been down these paths, they've made the right decisions, and those are the people who can advise us, and we ask them, please show us the way. And the Mesilas Yesharim says that is the reason why we ask Chachamim, we ask wise men for advice, because they've been down these paths, they know the right directions, and our job is to trust them because their wisdom allows them, their perspective allows them to know the right way to go. Now, as you know, very recently there was a big tumult in the blogging world. Maybe if you read the Ated or the Modia, you saw all the letters to the editor because the concert bans, the big issue. Some 30-odd Rabbanim put a ban against a certain concert in Madison Square Garden, and it became a major, big deal. And I received a number of emails and questions about, it's a tremendous nusayon for Emunas Chachamim. It's a test, it's a challenge of our belief in the wisdom of Chachamim. Okay, now I'd like to share with you why it is, to some people, a test of their Emunas Chachamim, of their trusting in the Rabbanim, in the wise people of our generation. The reason why it's a test is because they know fully well that the Chachamim, that the Rabbanim who signed that letter were wrong. Not only do they know that the Rabbanim who signed the letter are wrong, they're dead wrong. They're foolish. These Rabbanim, 30 odd of them, signed on a letter that's very foolish, that's dumb, and for the life of me, I can't believe why they would do something so wrong. And because I know that they did something so foolish, it's a challenge to my entire emunas chachamim. I can no longer feel secure and trusting the leaders of our generation because the whole thing is suspect. Okay. It was FDR who was first credited with a line that's been repeated in many, many different transformations, but the original line was, I believe, said by FDR, and that is, everyone who knows how to run the country seems to be cutting hair and shining shoes. And what Franklin Delano Roosevelt was saying there was, every time I go to the barber tells me the right way to run the country. Every time I get a shoe shine, the shoe shine boy tells me the right way to sign bills into effect and the right way to run the country. Well, isn't it a bit curious that he's shining shoes, he's cutting hair, and I'm at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue sitting in the White House? And what FDR was saying was, just because you can express an opinion does not make you right. And you could express your opinion very articulately. You could even firmly believe that you're right, but that doesn't make you right. And if you look at a letter signed by the Chachamim, and you know that they're wrong and you're right, the first thing you better question is, are you right? Now, my friends, let me be quite frank about this. If you are, Rahman al-San, shouldn't happen to anybody, but if your kid has a tumor, you will not perform brain surgery on your child. You will not say to the doctor, okay, just show me which hemisphere. Oh, you say it's next to the corpus callosum, between the cerebral cortex and below. How far do I have to reach in? Just show me the scalpel. I'll do it myself because I don't really trust you. You get it that neurosurgery is not my field. I'm not really skilled in that. And you trust the surgeon. You trust the doctors. That letter was signed by over 30 Rabbanim who are older, wiser, whose names, by the way, Rav Matashel Solomon, Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky, Rav David Feinstein, leaders of our generation who I firmly believe have a much better perspective on life than you and I do, who have been through this thing called life a lot longer than we have and are much more likely to be right than me, even if I want to go to that particular concert, even if I think Lipa is the greatest and most spectacular thing in the world. If you'd like to know who's more likely to be right, my suspicion is that the Rabbanim who signed that letter are more likely to be correct. However, that really isn't the point I want to share with you. Throughout the entire controversy, I couldn't be motivated to even think about the issue. I couldn't even, it was like, I couldn't even allow it to enter any part of my conscious brain. And I'll share with you why. It became clear to me when my 16-year-old daughter asked me the question when we were driving. I was driving at a school, and she likes to play music. And ironically, as she was talking about the subject, there was a CD playing in the car. And the song that was playing was Habeit Min Shamayim Arei. It's from Tachanun, and I'll translate to you the words. Look from heaven and see, we've been a mockery and abused by the Gentiles. We are considered like sheep to the slaughter, to kill and waste, destroy, to pummel and shame. And with all this, we have not forgotten your name. Habeit Min Shamayim Arei. Look from Shamayim, look down. That was the song that was playing in the background as my daughter is asking me about the concert ban. And I said to myself, that's exactly it. Do you understand what was considered a shaila of emunas chachamim or emunah in previous generations? When Jews were being slaughtered wholesale in the streets, when Jews were being abused and mocked daily, when Jewish blood was so cheap that you couldn't leave your house knowing that you'd come back, and still, Shimcha lo shachachnu Hashem, we were still steadfast in our belief, we clung to our belief, we kept the religion. That was the Nisayan of Emunah in previous generations. In our generation, when the Chachamim sign a ban against a concert, which for the record, how many concerts did most people go to a year? How much does it change their life if they could never go to a single concert again in their entire existence? How big is it in their world? And it becomes a huge shayla of amunus chachamim. My faith in the sages is challenged. I'm not sure I could trust them anymore because, do you know why? Because it's me. It's me at the center of this question. It's me right there, and something is being taken from me, and my objectivity is lost. My cool, calculated intellect is gone. Something is being robbed from me, and I become very, very dumb. My prejudice, my bias, my self-interest overcome to the extent that I cannot be dispassionate. I cannot be thought out. And I'm challenged, and I look at these chachamim as if they're entrapping me, they're imprisoning me, I'm being hurt. And we recognize how foolish it is. If you're a kid and music is a big deal, okay. But the bloggers aren't 15 years old. The people who are writing letters to the editors are mature adults. And what you quickly see is that we human beings, over and over, are human beings. And it doesn't matter whether you're old or young, the minute it's me in the center of that issue, the minute the challenge is me, it doesn't matter even if your name is Esther Hamalka, who was 75 years old at the time, who was a tremendous tzaddikus, who was a woman of tremendous valor. And when it was her life on the line, there was a prejudice, there was a bias. Mordechai said to her, you're no longer cool and calculated, you're nogea b'davar, you're no longer dispassionate, and the result was that her judgment was biased, and she made an error in judgment. And that's a reality of all of us humans. Anytime I'm involved, I'm prejudiced, I'm biased, my judgment is to be suspect, and the only solution is to ask advice. The only solution is to rely on the Chachamim who have that different perspective, who sit in that beach chair, who look down on the different path and say, Zu haderech yelchu bo, go in this path, go this way because that's the right way. And if you're a wise person, you train yourself to trust others who have a different vantage point, who have a better perspective, and you rely on them, even if it demands certain major changes, like not going to concerts for the while. Now, that being said, I want to share with you something I find very, very interesting. In our generation, there is one of the greatest Kiddush Hashems that is also one of the most serious Chillul Hashems that can ever be imagined. And that is an institution, an organization called Zaka. Now, as you know, Zaka in Israel is a group of people who are first responders to terrorist attacks. They really serve two functions. One is as sort of Hatzalah, the paramedics, and oftentimes if they get there early enough, they're able to save lives. But they serve the function of what they call Chesed Shel Emes. In fact, on their badge, it says Chesed Shel Emes. They're responsible to collect the body parts. They're responsible to collect the blood. They're responsible to make sure that every Jew who is injured in one of these terrorist attacks gets a proper burial. So on the one hand, it is a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, because what they're demonstrating is true chesed. They don't know the people who were attacked, they don't know the injured parties, but they go to very great lengths to make sure that Jewish people are given their last honor and are treated with the accord and dignity that a Jew should be treated with. And in that sense, it's a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. However, I want you to hear what I'm saying. It is the most egregious Chillul Hashem you could ever imagine, that there is an institution called Zaka in the world. That there are people who are equipped with the fastest motorcycles to get there on the scene because Jewish babies are blown up on a regular basis. Because Jewish people are destroyed, killed in our own homeland. And there's a whole institution. And you see an entire legion of the motorcycles who are prepared to gather together the body parts and collect the Jewish blood. That is the most egregious Chillul Hashem you could ever imagine. Because what you're seeing is God's people are food, fodder for the cannon, that to be destroyed, lahashmid, laharug, la'abed, to be murdered, to be butchered. And it is one of the greatest Chillul Hashems you could ever imagine or envision. And it is a very difficult time that we just celebrated on Rosh Chodesh Adar, when we all know that there is a special inyan, Mishenichnas Adar Marbe B'Simcha. When Adar comes in, we're supposed to be increasing in happiness. And on Thursday night, on Rosh Chodesh Adar, in Yeshiva Merkas HaRav, a Israeli Arab came into the yeshiva and began spraying, I read according to one account, 500 rounds. At the end of the day, 19 people were very seriously injured, 8 dead, and the scene was very, very difficult to live through when you see the next day the funeral and you see the 15-year-old boys carrying out the body of their classmate, and you see that the ones who were killed were young Yeshiva Bochurim, and you recognize what occurred. And then you read, of course, the reaction from the Palestinian people, the thousands who are celebrating, the Gaza streets that are filled with the joyous crowds giving out candy, the air of celebration. What a wondrous accomplishment. And the first question, I guess, that begs being asked is, who is at fault? Who's responsible for this? To say that the rabid dog who went in shooting is responsible would be, on one level, true. But if you'd like to know who's responsible, I don't think it's a far stretch to say that the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Omar Peres, the government of Israel, is responsible for those murders. And the reason is quite obvious. The primary responsibility of government is the defense of its peoples. That is first and primary of the responsibilities of a government. And when a government fails its people willingly, bemazed, then it is guilty of murder. And I'd like to explain to you why I believe this government is guilty of those crimes. You see, any sovereign nation understands that its role is to protect its people, and it has the right to exist and the right to defend its men, women, and children. That is true unless you're a leftist, liberal Israeli. If that is your political stance, then it's very questionable whether you have a right to exist, very questionable whether you have a right to be in the land, and you find yourself in a very difficult stance when you have a total lack of moral certitude. And let me explain to you in plain language what I mean. On September 11th, 2001, the United States of America was attacked on its homeland. President Bush, at the time, recognizing that there was a perpetrator, told the world in no uncertain terms, we will bring that man to justice. It was determined that Osama bin Laden, on some level, was the mastermind behind this. And it was also determined that Osama bin Laden was hiding out in Afghanistan. Afghanistan did not fund Osama bin Laden's plan. They did not back him. It just happened to have been that he hid out and escaped into Afghanistan. At which point, the President of the United States of America gave a very clear ultimatum to Afghanistan. Either deliver him to us or we are coming in. Afghanistan said no. The United States troops entered Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a far, far stretch away from the World Trade Centers. It is not in the outskirts of Brooklyn even. I don't even think it's somewhere further than Cincinnati. It's very far away. They were not involved. They didn't perpetrate the act. They didn't sponsor the act. They didn't stand behind it. But the murderer is there. We will seek him out and demand his being given over to us, because that is the right of a country to defend its citizenry. Blood isn't cheap. Acts will not go without being avenged. There have been so many fatalities that it is difficult to count. When I was teaching 5 years ago, I began every day when I would give it a handout to the guys, I would keep the count of the wounded and killed on the top. I'd print it out on each day's handout, and each day when it went to 4,000, 4,001, 4,002, the guys would see the new count as it went up. That was 4 years ago. It is very difficult to count the amount of fatalities and casualties that happen on a daily basis. And there's really one very simple observation. If any other country was even remotely attacked in that manner, it wouldn't have begun. Israel has easily the power, the firepower, the manpower to destroy terrorism, to stop it in a heartbeat. If Israel would act in the way that any other country would act, there would not be any of these terrorist attacks, because they would put an end to it as any nation would. And there's only one reason why Israel doesn't do it. And the reason really is quite simple. Because the Palestinians and the Arabs are upset. And they're angry. And why are they angry? Why do they hate us? They're just like us. It must be that we've done something bad to them, something very bad. We've oppressed them. We've taken away their rights, despite the fact that it's a known fact that the Arabs have more rights in Israel than Arabs do in any other country. They have greater opportunities for education, greater opportunity for income, greater opportunity for advancements. But there's a sense that we are guilty of doing something wrong, because why is the Arab street so angry? And do we have a right to this land? Do we have a right to stand up and protect? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But my friends, here's a very simple observation. I'm preaching to the choir. Because if you talk to frum people in Israel today, they agree with this perspective very clearly. The problem is that 75% of our nation are not religious. 75% of our nation have a secular bias. And if you're a secular Israeli, you have a very real problem. And that problem is, it doesn't make sense. Why should the Arabs hate us? Why should the Palestinians hate us? There's no such idea of innately hating a Jew. There's no such concept of the Jewish nation being chosen and having a unique destiny. There's no concept of God running the world with various forces and this being a dog to keep the people in a certain perspective. And since that perspective isn't there, the only conclusion must be we've oppressed them, we've hurt them, we have to give them back land, we have to appease them. Heaven forfend for us to cut off electricity to Gaza. Cutting off electricity is considered too much of a strong stance. We can't do that to them. We can't stop their water. And my friends, the end of it is really quite simple. The end of it is when a murderer comes into a yeshiva and kills 8. No one understands that it is the Rosh HaMemshala, it is the governing body that is responsible for that, and they're guilty of one crime. That crime is called stupidity. And that is a crime if you're in power. And the reason why they're guilty of stupidity is because they are no gea b'davar. They're caught way in that maze. They look left, they look right, and they can't see a way out. If they had a different perspective, if they had a higher perspective, if they had that beach chair perspective looking down, they would see there is no solution. The Arabs don't hate you because you're oppressing them. They hated you before you oppressed them. They attacked prior to 1948, before there was a state of Israel, and they attacked in 48 and 56 and 67 and 73, and it's not going to stop. No matter how much land you give them, and the solution is not in that path. But as long as your bias, as long as your prejudice, as long as your self-interest blinds you, you'll never see that. And it is a very, very sad day when our own nation have so lost their sense of moral certitude, of their right to be in the land. They're so blinded by things that they're absolutely acting like fools. What Mordechai was saying to Esther was a very clear point. She was saying, you are no gea b'davar. You have a prejudice here. You are not looking at this from an absolutely clear perspective. Because you're in the palace, because it's your life at stake, you feel secure, hence you're judging this incorrectly. What's influencing your decision to wait and not go immediately is not because of strategy, not because it's wiser, but because you feel safe. Mordechai spoke right to the bias, right to the Negiah, and said, don't think you're going to be saved here. God runs the world, not you. He was talking to the Negiah, talking to the prejudice. And one of the great lessons in life is that all of our moral issues, all of our fights, rarely have to do with challenges where it's black and it's white. The chimp being a primate, cannot control itself. The M&Ms that are here, if it's more or less, it can't stop itself. The human can. The vast majority of our moral fights are not when it's black and white, not when I want it but I know it's wrong. It's when I get caught in this darkness of physicality and everything sort of becomes gray and muddled. And the Mesilas Yesharim tells us there are two mistakes that darkness causes. You could walk by the pothole and not see it, find yourself deep in the ditch and not even realize you ended up there. But more serious is the second type of mistake. When you see something in front of you and you see that pillar and you assume it's a man, or you see the man and you assume it's a pillar, and because your sight has fooled you, you pursue that path, you defend that path, and you tell the world, this is the right way, this is the way to go. But because you're blind in the darkness, you're following a very, very foolish path. A wise man understands that the system the Torah created is for us to be shoal eitzah, for us to ask on big questions and on little questions. When there's an edict from 30 Rabbanim signed discussing a particular issue, sit back and ask yourself, how good are you at brain surgery? And if the answer is you're not that good, don't go do brain surgery. If you haven't lived that many years, if you haven't been through that much of life, don't go exposing yourself and your shallowness by arguing with those who are far wiser, far greater. More than anything, recognize that you're no gay of a dover. It's your self-interest, it's your bias that prevents you from seeing. What FDR was saying was, because you have an opinion doesn't mean you're right. If you're a shoeshine boy, you're a shoeshine boy despite the fact that you think you know international politics. Despite the fact that you think you know how to run the world, that doesn't make you correct. And this understanding, I think, has a very real, unfortunate result in our generation when the leaders of the Israeli people are following a path that is so foolish, so foolhardy, and unfortunately they can't see it because of their bias, because of their being so enveloped in it, they're locked and there's nothing they can do, and it is a very, very sad day to watch. Sometimes we have to wake up, and sometimes we have to understand things differently. I'd like to close with a last point from the Megillah, and that is something that was mentioned in a previous Shmuz. The very end of the story, when Haman comes back to Zeresh, and she tells him, and he tells everything that happened. The sus, instead of me being on top of the horse, I was pulling the horse. Instead of my enemy being the one in the street, he was up on the horse, and he tells the whole story. And afterwards, Zeresh says the following words: "Imizera haYehudim, Mordechai, if this Mordechai is Jewish, nofal tipol, you surely fall." You know something, my husband? If this fellow Mordechai is Jewish, you're in big trouble. Now, I don't mean to be rude, but was Zeresh following the plot line here? Mordechai the tzaddik was the Rosh Sanhedrin. He was the Jew with the long beard. Haman was fighting against the Jews. Zeresh was a very wise woman. They knew exactly the score, and they knew exactly who Mordechai was. There was no mistaking that it was a fight against Jews. Yet now, all the way at the end, Zeresh says, oh my goodness, if Mordechai is Jewish, you're in big trouble. No fault people. Says the Gemara, what she was saying was a bit different. Imizera Yehudi Mordechai nofal tipol means as follows. This nation, says the Gemara Megillah, Umazu Meshula La'afar Meshula Kachavim. This nation is compared to the dirt and compared to the stars. Kishim Yordim Yodim Marafa. When they fall to the dirt. Kishim Olin, when they rise up L'Kachavim. Says Zeresh to her husband, don't you get it? Everything has been reversed. You were able to crush them. You were able to decree to kill them because they had sinned. They were down. And when they're down, anyone can murder them. Anyone can crush them because they're compared to the dirt on the beach. Anyone can step on them. But once they've turned around, once they've done tshuva, they're like the stars. They're untouchable. They're God's people. And there's nothing that you can do. Nafal tipol, you will surely fall. Every once in a while, it is worthwhile to gain a lesson in Emunah from our enemies. Zeresh understood very clearly, when the Jewish people serve Hashem, they're untouchable. When the Jewish people do not serve Hashem, they're nafal tipol, and they end up wherever they happen to end up. My Rebbe Yeshiva said this 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. Would you like to know why we have so much trouble in Israel? It's not because of the Chiloni, it's not because of the secular Jews, it's because the frum Jews didn't take the secular Jews and teach them. Before you go burn the bus stops, how many secular Jews did you invite into your house and show them a Shabbos? How many of your brothers were you makari? And the reality is that 75% of our nation in Israel are not religious. And it's very hard to blame them because we're as much to blame. We have a very unique destiny. We are a very special people. If we serve Hashem, we are compared to the stars. If not, we're compared to the dirt. May Hashem grant us that this is the last Purim that we have to discuss these type of issues. May this be the last Purim in our exile. May we celebrate the next one in Yerushalayim.